Welcome to the Wife Stories YouTube channel. New video every day, and don't forget to subscribe. Here we go.
The doorbell rang, and for a moment I thought I might just stay where I was, on the hard living room floor, curled up on my side, my cheek pressing against the cold tile. The chime echoed through the house once, twice. My legs felt too heavy to move, like they'd turned to lead sometime in the night. I found myself barely breathing, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the rasp of my own shallow inhale. I had no idea who stood outside my door at that hour, and I couldn't summon the will to call out, or even to check the time. In that stillness, I realized how exhausted I was, physically and mentally. One quiet moment blurred into the next, until the doorbell finally fell silent. No one knocked, no footsteps departed, so maybe the visitor still waited, maybe not. I shut my eyes, fighting the urge to slip back into the half-nightmare, half-memory that had pinned me here in the first place. Sometimes I wonder if a body can become too tired to even register pain. There's a phase where you go numb, not because the agony has left you, but because it's grown too large to process. That's where I was. Moments later, I heard a subtle click from the other side of the door, as though someone decided to let themselves in. I tried to lift my head, but the best I managed was turning my face away from the living room couch. The same couch where everything had changed. I recall thinking that I never wanted to look at that couch again. I heard slow footsteps approach, an exhale, then silence. A phone buzzed. Another silence. Finally, I felt a hand hover near my shoulder. It didn't touch me. Maybe it didn't dare. In that instant, a thought flickered. I've reached a point in life where the worst has already happened. Why stand up at all? The question settled over me like a blanket, oddly comforting and terrifying. I could just stay there forever, letting the cold seep into my bones. But I'm a stubborn man. Slowly, with something like a sigh, I forced my palms flat against the floor and pushed up. My spine cracked in protest. Every muscle reminded me that I'd been on this tile too long. I heard the rustle of clothes as the figure standing near me shifted, uncertain. I still couldn't see them, but I felt their presence like a weight in the room. My vision blurred, though my eyes were open. Blood roared in my ears. I exhaled, half expecting to see someone else. Maybe her, or him. But it was just a friend I'd known since college. He said nothing, only extended a bottle of water. I reached for it. My fingertips shook around the plastic as I took a sip. The water tasted stale, or maybe that was just me. I swallowed anyway, letting it soothe the dryness in my throat. I saw in his eyes the question "Are you okay?" A question he never voiced. I was grateful he didn't. That was something we had in common, a profound respect for each other's silences. I tried standing. My knees wobbled, and a momentary wave of dizziness forced me to lean against the sofa. I clenched my jaw, hating how weak I felt. In my head, a voice repeated, she was here. She was here with him. I forced that voice away. The friend waited, patient as a statue. Then I raised my gaze to the door, noticing the hush outside. The doorbell was quiet now, the entire neighborhood silent. I took a deeper breath and tried to return to the present. He murmured something about being worried when I didn't answer his calls. He said he used the spare key to check on me. I nodded absently. In the hush, the whir of the fridge sounded louder than ever. His presence there was the final push I needed to at least try to re-enter the world of the living. I gestured for him to sit, but he just shook his head. We didn't have to talk. Sometimes there's a grace in letting the unspoken remain that way. So I told him, quietly, that I was fine. Lied straight to his face. He saw through it, unsure, but he gave a slight nod. Another hush. Then, with an awkward scratch at the back of his head, he slipped out the door, leaving me alone again. I tried to breathe in that solitude, letting my eyes roam around the living room. My living room. A place that once felt safe, The walls still carried pictures of a life I thought I had. My wife Jen beaming at me under a bright summer sun, me holding up a newly signed contract for my small tech startup. Everything full of promise. I sank onto the sofa, my mind drifting back to that night just 4 weeks ago. 2 in the morning, the distinct sense that something was wrong. Asterisk show. Don't tell asterisk. A voice in my head used to remind me. Asterisk show what it felt like. Asterisk so I do. I remember walking up to the door, noticing that the lights were off inside. Our house was typically dark at that hour, so at first it didn't strike me as unusual. Then the hush. I reached for my key, but the lock clicked differently that night, like it recognized a foreign key instead. For a second, my brain froze on that sound, as though it wanted to believe I was imagining things. I eased the door open, letting the subtle glow from the street lamp spill onto the foyer floor. 2 quiet voices, murmurs, then a breathy laugh. A laugh that wasn't mine. I toed off my shoes so I wouldn't make a sound, creeping down the hallway. A hush, then something like a stifled moan. I paused by the corner leading to the living room, my heart hammering in my throat. They were right there. I heard the shuffle of bodies on the couch, a muffled giggle. Jen's voice, quiet and pleading. The kind of plea that's half laughter, half desire. The next moment, I peered around the corner, just enough to see them. Their outlines in the dark. Skin on skin, the faint light from a phone screen illuminating his broad shoulders, his tensed back, her hands gripping at him. My entire chest contracted. I don't remember breathing. There was an undeniable erotic charge in the air, as if they were both too caught up to sense my presence. Her hair was spilled over the cushions, and I could see the arch of her neck, the way her mouth parted in something between pleasure and a hushed cry. Time slowed. For a second, I felt outside of my own body, watching a scene that felt like it belonged to someone else's life, not mine. But it was my home, my couch, my wife. I felt a surge of nausea, and at the same time, an almost surreal calm. He kissed her neck. She tangled her fingers in his hair, whispered his name. Asterisk Tom. Asterisk, that's when my heart truly broke. Because that name and that voice, my wife's voice, fused into a moment I couldn't unsee or unhear. If it had been an impersonal fling, if I hadn't recognized the man, maybe it would have been different. But Tom was a public investor, a flashy presence in certain circles, a man who thrived on deals and image. Asterisk, and she's with him. Asterisk, my chest tightened with each fresh wave of betrayal. I stepped forward, quietly, until I stood at the edge of the living room. The phone screen on the coffee table cast enough light to reveal me. Jen froze first. She gasped, eyes flying wide when she saw me in the shadows. Tom jerked upright, grabbing for his shirt, half falling onto the floor in the process. I said nothing. My heart hammered so loud I thought they could hear it, but I was strangely composed, calm. Tom's breath caught, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape. Jen scrambled to cover herself with a throw blanket, or maybe she was just trying to hide from me. For a few seconds, the 3 of us existed in that suspended moment, like a frame of a film locked on screen. I took out my phone. In the glow of that little device, I could see Tom's face go pale, rid the panic in his expression. I pressed a few keys, my voice surprisingly steady. "Turn on the TV," I said, though it came out in a hushed monotone. "I have footage." I glanced at Tom. "You walked into my home with my wife." The smart lock recorded the time, the date, your face, a beat of silence. "You're a public figure, an investor, right? This might be the kind of story people enjoy." Jen let out a trembling breath. She tried to speak, but words failed her. Tom muttered something about how this wasn't what I thought, how he could explain. I gave a slight shake of my head, the corners of my mouth twitching into a half-smile. I imagine it must have looked more like a grimace. Jen started to plead. "James, please." She reached a hand toward me, tears already welling in her eyes. But I stepped back. The air felt charged, as though we were all waiting for someone to light a match. My chest felt oddly hollow. I snapped a quick photo with my phone. Nothing graphic, just enough context to prove they were together. Tom cursed, demanded I stop. I lowered the phone and locked my gaze on him. He fumbled with his shirt, still half naked. I noticed the edges of a faint bruise on his collarbone. My wife's lips must have left that mark. It was such a small detail, but it seared my mind like a brand. He finally spat out a question. "What do you want?" He was trying so hard to sound in control, but fear cracked his voice. Jen was sobbing now, words tumbling over themselves, but I barely listened. Instead, I quietly repeated what I'd said. "I'll show everyone if I have to." Then I turned to her. "I'm done, Jen." I remember the way her sobs caught in her throat when she heard that final note in my voice. Then I walked out of the room, leaving them both in the aftershock of my calm. I didn't shout. I didn't fling furniture or break anything. I just went upstairs, phone tight in my hand, mind swirling. I sat on the bed for God knows how long, just staring at the darkness. After a while, I heard doors slam, muffled arguments downstairs, then the front door opening and closing. Footsteps. Jen was crying, calling my name from behind the locked bedroom door. I told her I needed to be alone. Eventually, everything went quiet. For the next few days, we barely spoke. When we did, my words came out strangely calm, as though I was reading lines from a script. I'd ask if she wanted coffee. I'd discuss bills. But never once did I raise the subject of what I'd witnessed. She tried a couple times. Quiet, desperate attempts. "James, we need to talk." I'd reply, "Later, or not now." And then the subject would die. It was horrifying how easy it became for me to slip into a hollow mechanical version of myself. I kept going to work. My employees noticed a certain edge in my tone, but nobody dared to ask. I'd sit in my office, thinking about next steps as though it was a business problem. That's who I am. The man who breaks life down into tasks and objectives. And my objective was to get everything I needed. Legally, financially, emotionally. No mistakes, no rash decisions. I started collecting data, text messages, emails, anything I could find that pointed to Jen's ongoing affair with Tom. I was thorough, as if building a case. I even accessed a joint account she and I still used, noticing certain unexplained charges that linked back to Tom. Quiet dinners, hotel rooms. They'd been careful, but not careful enough. In the evenings, I'd come home and cook dinner. I'd set out 2 plates, just like always. Jen would sit, looking haunted, picking at her food. My expression never shifted. I'd ask her how her day went in a mild tone, sipping from my water glass as though we were any other couple in America. But beneath that veneer, I was dissecting everything, looking for patterns, cross-referencing receipts. I felt empty inside, a husk of the man I used to be. Sometimes, after dinner, I'd step into the living room and eye the couch. My stomach would twist. Then I'd gather my laptop and retreat to the study, ignoring Jen's watery pleas. Once behind the closed door, I'd study more data. 3 weeks passed like this. She stopped trying to talk about us. Maybe she gave up, or maybe she sensed that I'd become something unrecognizable. My greatest fear had been that I would lose control, start shouting, break down, maybe even hurt someone. Instead, I discovered a new fear, that I'd become so numb, so methodical, that I would never feel anything again. Late at night, I'd lie awake thinking, asterisk, I could just die. And this, and the noise in my head. Asterisk, that was the real darkness, a calm, absolute conviction that nothing mattered. Sometimes I even prayed for that release, but something inside me refused to let go, maybe just my stubbornness. I told myself I had one last mission to accomplish. The day I finally made my move, the sky was bright with a harsh sun. The heat soared, making the city shimmer. I left the house early. Jen was still asleep, or pretending to be. I took a taxi downtown and visited a high-rise that glowed with mirrored windows. Tom's office was on the 27th floor. Elegant, modern. I was buzzed in by his secretary after a brief wait in a minimalist lounge area. When I stepped into his office, Tom was already pacing behind his polished desk, fiddling with something on his phone. He froze upon seeing me. He shot me a tense look. "So," he said, clearing his throat, "I guess we should talk." I slipped my hands into my pockets. "We already did talk, indirectly," I said with a small shrug. "Now, I've got a proposal." He was wearing a sleek navy suit, tie loosened around his collar. The moment I mentioned proposal, I saw his eyes flicker with a mixture of greed and caution. To men like Tom, business is the one language they speak fluently. He gestured at a chair. I declined. "What kind of proposal?" he asked, smoothing his tie and leaning back against the desk, trying to appear casual. But I saw the tension in his eyes. I pulled a single sheet of paper from an envelope in my jacket. It was a contract, typed up by me, carefully worded. "I found something interesting," I said, stepping forward. "A potential gold mine for your investment fund. If you're willing to sign this document, we can proceed. If not, well..." I let the words hang. He watched me for a moment. Then he took the paper, skimming it. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. Maybe because the terms looked ridiculously generous. Too good to be real. But men like Tom can't resist the promise of a sweet deal, especially one that places them on the ground floor of a supposedly lucrative venture. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the text. "I don't see your attorney's name on here," he said slowly, eyes darting to mine. "I don't need an attorney for a personal arrangement," I replied. "You do understand that this is extremely confidential." One whisper, and it all collapses. He frowned. "What's the catch?" He looked up, meeting my gaze. "You seriously think I'll jump at this without reading every line?" I allowed a thin smile. "Read it if you want," I said softly. "But do it quickly. The opportunity won't last. And if you'd prefer we handle things differently, I've got a different stack of papers ready to go to the media. You understand?" I slid my phone out of my pocket just enough for him to see the screen. A silent threat. The phone, with its stored evidence. Nothing to say it outright, just the subtle implication that I could blow up his public persona at any moment. He swallowed, flicking his gaze from the phone to the contract. I knew his type. A gambler at heart, always betting he could handle the fallout later. He was too proud to cave, but too ambitious to resist. His moral lines had blurred long ago. Without fully reading, he grabbed a pen from the desk. "Fine," he said. "Let's do this." He signed, scrawling his signature with a flourish. Then he blew out a breath, handing the paper back. "So, what now?" I slipped the contract back into the envelope. "Now you wait," I told him. "In about a week, you'll see the results, financially." I gave him an oddly polite nod, and turned to go. At the door, I paused. I could almost feel his stare drilling into my back. "One more thing," I said quietly. "If I were you, I'd steer clear of my house. Whatever you had with Jen, it's over." He tensed, a flash of anger in his expression. But he said nothing. He knew he'd lost the high ground. He thought he'd made a decent bargain to preserve his reputation, but he had no idea how thoroughly I'd crafted those lines in the contract. Once I left that office, I felt the slightest flutter in my chest. Something almost like satisfaction. Not happiness, not relief, but the sense that a piece of my plan had clicked into place. I spent the next week finalizing every detail. Accounts, legalities, shares of Tom's fund that would transfer. The sweet deal I dangled was actually a Trojan horse, structured so that his acceptance handed me controlling interest in key segments of his business. He'd only see the trap once it was irreversible. I knew he'd try to challenge it in court eventually, but I had the evidence, and I also knew he'd do nearly anything to avoid a public scandal that could cost him his entire empire. Jen, meanwhile, was in a strange limbo at home, nervous, tiptoeing around me. She stopped wearing her wedding ring, maybe out of guilt or shame. She looked exhausted, as though she barely slept. Each morning, I'd observe her in the kitchen, rummaging for cereal, wanting to say something but never mustering the courage. I offered her short nods, empty greetings, and that was the limit of our conversation. Then came the day I set everything in motion. The documents were executed electronically. With a few keystrokes, I watched Tom's business become mine. He wouldn't discover the scale of my takeover until his lawyers frantically tried to parse the confusing arrangement. I felt no remorse. It was almost mechanical. Flipping the switch, I stared at the computer screen in the hush of my home office, feeling an emptiness churn in my gut. Asterisk, this is your vengeance. Asterisk, I thought. Asterisk, you have it. Now what? Asterisk, 2 hours later, Jen came home from a grocery run. I heard plastic bags rustle as she dropped them on the countertop. I stepped out of the study, scanning her face. She looked wary. I told her nothing of my plan. In many ways, she was left out in the cold, uncertain where she stood. So I made it crystal clear. I'm leaving, I said, my voice even. You can stay here for now, if you want, but you get nothing else. I paused, my gaze drifting to the wedding photo on the wall. The assets, house, finances, are in my name. Every last account. You'll see soon enough. She blinked, tears forming in her eyes again. What? James, you? How can you? Don't pretend to be surprised, I replied. You made your choice. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. It was like she tried to argue and realized she had no defense. In that quiet, I remembered the moment I'd found her with Tom. The image burned behind my eyelids. I forced myself not to dwell on it. This was the final step, severing the ties, letting her feel the gravity of her betrayal. Yet I took no pleasure in it. If anything, I felt numb, like I was checking off the last item on a grim to-do list. She tried to approach me, arms half raised as though she might embrace me. James, she whispered, tears on her cheeks. I know I messed up, but can't we just? I stepped back. No, I said simply. Then, after a pause, I'm not your husband anymore, Jen. I'm your consequence. She flinched, sobbing softly. For a moment, I saw the woman I'd once loved, that memory of her joy and warmth. But it was overshadowed by the recollection of her face twisted in pleasure with another man, in my home, on my couch. A wave of bitterness churned my stomach. Asterisky won't lose control, asterisk, I reminded myself. Asterisk scheme beyond that. Asterisk, I never wanted this, she said. I was lonely. You were never around. You were so busy. You? She stopped. She must have realized blaming me would do no good. I'm sorry, she whispered. I studied her tear-streaked face. For a moment, I almost believed her. Then I recalled the wave of hush that followed my discovery, her repeated attempts to justify it, the messages I'd found on her phone. I exhaled a long breath, turned away. I'm done talking. Her voice rose a notch. You'd really leave me with nothing. She gestured around. I put my soul into this place, James. You can't just. I swung my gaze back to her, cold. You left me with nothing when you broke our marriage. Now it's your turn. My tone was as devoid of warmth as the tile floor under my shoes. She sank into a chair, face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I thought I would feel triumphant or at least vindicated, but inside, I only felt a hollow ache. Asterisk, this is the cost of justice, asterisk, I told myself. Asterisk, there's no relief. Only emptiness. Asterisk, that was the last conversation we had under the same roof. I left that afternoon, carrying just a small bag of clothes and my laptop. The rest of my belongings could wait. I checked into a hotel across town, ignoring the odd looks from the front desk clerk. I paid in advance for a week, though I didn't plan on staying that long. My phone buzzed with messages from Jen, then from unknown numbers, likely her friends or maybe Tom. I ignored them all, tossing the phone onto the bed and pressing my palms against my eyes. The tangle in my head wouldn't unravel. I felt the weight of everything, the months of stress, the final blow of betrayal. A tiny voice inside whispered that I had what I wanted, revenge, or retribution, or something like that. So why did I feel so empty? Night fell. I paced the small hotel room, opening the curtains to stare at the city lights. The bed behind me looked untouched, perfectly made. I left the TV off, not wanting any noise. In that quiet, I forced myself to let go. If I was free now, maybe I could finally see a future. Maybe. But some part of me still struggled with the idea that the life I'd built was in ruins, and that, to a large extent, I'd leveled it myself in the name of vengeance. I gave in to exhaustion around 2 in the morning, flopping onto the bed fully clothed. I drifted into a restless doze, dreams swirling with images, Jen's tearful face, Tom's arrogant smirk, the contract with his signature, the living room couch. Over and over, these fragments played until I startled awake, gasping. The next few days were a blur. Lawyers called with updates. Tom was in a panic, trying to figure out how so much of his investment fund had been signed away. He threatened lawsuits, but the contract was ironclad. He'd signed it of his own free will, no duress. So he switched to bargaining, wanting to buy back control. I refused every offer. I had him pinned. Word spread quietly among certain business circles, but the real reason behind our arrangement remained hidden, thanks to the NDAs I'd built in. Tom never dared to go public, because the moment he did, I'd be free to share the security footage. He was stuck. Jen attempted to call me daily, sending messages that ranged from pleading to apologetic to furious. I read them in silence, then deleted them. I felt no satisfaction in her desperation. If anything, her words only reminded me that my own heart was locked behind an emotional wall. Sometimes I'd stand in the hotel bathroom, staring at my reflection, hardly recognizing the man in the mirror, pale, hollow-eyed, with a face carved by sleepless nights. I'd think, so this is what victory feels like. On the 4th day of my self-imposed exile, I got a text from an unknown number. Short. We need to talk. I scoffed under my breath, hesitating for a moment before I typed back. Nothing to talk about. But in less than a minute, my phone buzzed again. The video snippet appeared, Tom, filming himself in a low-lit room, saying my name. The audio was garbled, but I caught words like, "I can ruin you too." My nostrils flared. I shut the clip off, adrenaline surging. He was threatening me. Maybe he found some leverage, or maybe he was bluffing. Either way, the tension flared again. This was not over. I decided to meet him, if only to put an end to the games. I agreed to see him at a rooftop bar downtown, public enough that neither of us could make a dramatic scene. When I arrived, he was already at a corner table, swirling a drink in his hand. The city skyline spread out behind him, neon lights reflecting on glass towers. He was out of his suit jacket, wearing a crisp shirt with the sleeves rolled up. I took note of the dark circles under his eyes and the stiffness in his posture. He tried to greet me with a cocky half smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I slid into the seat across from him, resting my hands on the table. He leaned in. "Look," he began in a tense whisper. "I'm not the bad guy here. You and Jen were already on the rocks. She told me you barely gave her attention. I raised a hand, silencing him. "I don't care," I said flatly. "You can justify it however you want. You slept with my wife. That's all I need to know." He shook his head, lips pressed tight. "I have investors who will leave if you don't fix this. I can't have you controlling a chunk of my assets. It's insane. I can make it worth your while if you walk away." I let out a quiet laugh. "It already is worth my while." "Seriously," he insisted, leaning forward. Name your price. You want to humiliate me? Fine, you've done it. But let's end this. If you let me buy out your stake, we can pretend none of this happened. We don't have to go nuclear. I stared at him for a long moment, letting his words settle. A memory of Jen's voice surfaced in my mind. Her breathy plea that night. My jaw clenched. You know, I said quietly. I thought about it. Taking a payoff. Moving on. But there's something I realized. I don't need money. I need closure. He frowned. Closure? This isn't therapy. It's business. Stop letting your emotions run the show. I shook my head. You still don't get it, I murmured. I don't have asterisk emotions anymore. This is methodical. You walked into my world and trashed it. Now I'm returning the favor. And let's be clear, I didn't bring your investors into this. You did. His knuckles whitened around the glass. I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten. Then he sighed, almost a groan of frustration. Look at us, he said, voice dropping. Two grown men who've wrecked each other's lives over a woman, whoa. I pinned him with a glare. Don't say her name. He fell silent, swirling the drink again. We sat like that, the hum of the city around us, tension thick in the air. After a beat, he finally said, Fine. I guess we're done here. He rose from the table, tossing some cash down for his drink, and leveled a cold stare at me. You're going to regret this, one way or another. I didn't respond. He turned and stalked off, weaving through the rooftop crowd, disappearing into the elevator bank. For a long time, I just sat there, gazing at the city lights, feeling strangely hollow once again. The wind whipped around me, ruffling the collar of my jacket, making me shiver. I wondered if that was the last time I'd ever speak to him, face to face. Probably not, but a part of me hoped it was. In the days that followed, Tom's threats turned out to be mostly hot air. My lawyers found no real opening for him to sabotage me. He was stuck. I continued to manage my newly acquired shares, quietly transferring leadership positions, effectively dismantling Tom's little empire from the inside. I wasn't exactly proud of it, but it had become an obsession. Like I couldn't stop until I'd undone him as thoroughly as he'd undone my marriage. Meanwhile, Jen left the house. She sent a short text telling me she was going to stay with her parents in Seattle for a while. I found myself reading that message twice, waiting for some surge of relief or sadness. Instead, I felt next to nothing, just a tired acceptance. I tried to imagine her packing her things, taking her small dog, maybe leaving behind the wedding photos she no longer wanted. The entire notion left me with a dull ache. Time passed in a weird haze. I moved out of the hotel and into a furnished rental near the beach, not far from my new offices. Waking up to the sound of waves had a small therapeutic effect. Some days, I'd walk along the shore at dawn, letting the cold water wash over my ankles, thinking about how easily life can turn on a single moment. Like that night, I discovered Jen and Tom. I wondered if I'd have been better off never knowing. Perhaps ignorance would have spared me the wave of bitterness that now defined my days. One morning, I woke with an ache in my chest that I couldn't ignore. Not physical pain, something deeper. I stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks, replaying the entire fiasco in my head for the 100th time. And for the first time since this all began, I found tears burning at the corners of my eyes. It felt foreign to me. I blinked, sniffed, tried to shove the feeling down. But it welled up anyway, a wave of sorrow and regret. Asteriski should have fought for her earlier. Asterisk, that small voice whispered. Asterisk, I should have seen the signs. Asterisk, instead, I'd let everything unravel. I forced myself out of bed and jogged along the beach for an hour, pushing my body until my lungs screamed. Anything to avoid that internal breakdown. Then I returned to my new place, showered, and put on the stoic mask again, like armor. That afternoon, I got an unexpected call from Jen's father. He was polite, formal. We'd never been close, but we'd always respected each other. He simply asked if I was willing to speak with Jen. Asterisk she's not well, asterisk he said. Asterisk depressed. Asterisk a pang of guilt tugged at me. But I told him I had nothing to say. It wasn't my place anymore. He didn't argue, just asked me to think it over. Then he hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, wrestling with a knot of emotions. Part of me wanted to shut out any mention of her. Another part felt an old sense of responsibility, a flicker of care. In the end, though, I did nothing. Evening came, and I collapsed onto the couch in my rental. I stared at the blank TV screen, remembering how my old living room looked. My mind conjured that final confrontation with her, the trembling in her voice, that haunted look in her eyes, the apology that came too late. Then the memory blurred into the moment I found her in Tom's arms. It was like a loop, a glitch in my brain that refused to let me rest. My chest tightened, tears pricking again. I muttered a half-crazed laugh, realizing how lost I felt. Asterisky have everything. Money, the business. And it means nothing. Asterisk, the emptiness remained. Possibly, that was the final cost of being betrayed. You get your revenge, but you can't bring back the part of you that believed in love, that felt truly alive. For a while, I drifted through life in that monotone haze. I handled operations for my new acquisitions, put out small fires here and there. I rarely left the office except for a solitary drink now and then. I saw a few old acquaintances, but they must have sensed the change in me. Conversations died quickly, replaced by awkward silence. My mind was too consumed with regret and the haunting sense that I'd become a shadow of a man. It was about a month after Jen's departure when I reached the tipping point. I was working late, scanning a set of documents, eyes burning from hours of reading. My phone beeped, a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. I pressed play, leaning back in my chair. Jen's voice spilled into my ear, raw and trembling. She said she'd tried to reach me a few times, but I wouldn't pick up. She sounded fragile, on the verge of tears. She apologized again, said she understood if I could never forgive her. But then she said something about the memories, how the life we'd shared was so precious to her, and how she now realized that the cost of losing me was more than she could bear. She ended by whispering, "I love you, James, even if you hate me. And I'm so sorry." The message clicked off. I stared at my phone for a long time. Rage, sorrow, longing, they all collided in my chest. The nerve of her, leaving that message after everything. But at the same time, a voice in me said, "Asterisk, she's human. She made a mistake." Asterisk, my knuckles turned white around the phone. I thought about that night again. The couch, the betrayal. Then I pressed delete on the voicemail. I told myself it was too late. The price had been paid. She had her regrets, fine. But regret doesn't erase betrayal. When I left the office that night, I was shaking. My reflection in the building's glass doors looked older, worn out. I walked to the parking lot, trying to calm my breathing. Then, in the hush of my car, I let out a choked sound. A half sob, half laugh. I sat there for an hour, engine off, headlights reflecting on the asphalt, wrestling with the swirl of emptiness. I wanted to unburden myself, but there was nobody to talk to. And the truth was, I wasn't even sure I could bear saying the words aloud. Asterisk, I miss her. Asterisk, because missing her felt like a betrayal of my own anger, my own revenge. Eventually, the days stretched into weeks, then a couple of months, as I continued to live in that limbo. Tom's attempts to salvage what he could of his fund turned into quiet backdoor deals, none of which could shake me out of controlling interest. He must have despised me, but I never heard from him directly after our rooftop meeting. Jen stayed away. The house was put on the market. My life became a series of bland routines. I'd eat, sleep, barely, work, and occasionally stare at the ocean in the mornings. My mind circled the same drain. Asterisk, what's left? Asterisk, one late afternoon, I found myself lying on the floor again, much like the day my friend discovered me. This time, I was in the living area of my rental, gazing at the ceiling, trying to figure out if I even cared about existing anymore. I'd gotten everything I thought I wanted. Revenge, the destruction of the man who wronged me, the punishment of the woman who betrayed me. But my heart felt blackened, like scorched earth. I closed my eyes, letting that suffocating sense of despair settle in. A faint buzzing from my phone cut through the silence. I considered ignoring it, but an odd instinct pulled me to look. It was a text from my attorney. Asterisk, Tom just signed final concessions. You are free to reorganize as you see fit. Congratulations. Asterisk, I stared at the words, waiting for some jolt of satisfaction. None came. I typed a quick acknowledgement and set the phone aside. That evening, I made a decision. I don't recall it being dramatic or theatrical, just a quiet acceptance that I could no longer live in this vacuum of bitterness. I stood, walked into my bedroom, and pulled out a small duffel bag. Then I packed enough clothes for a few weeks, left a note for my staff that I'd be unreachable for a while, and booked a ticket on the first morning flight to anywhere that wasn't here. Something about leaving everything behind felt right. Perhaps I was running. Perhaps I needed to run. Before dawn, I grabbed the bag and stepped outside. The early morning air smelled of salt and moisture, the horizon tinted a pale gray. I locked the door, took one last glance at the place that had become my solitary cage. Then I walked to my car and drove to the airport. I'm not sure how long I stayed on the road or how many months drifted by. The memories remain, but they feel distant. I recall mornings in remote motels where I'd wake to the muffled sounds of strangers passing by my door. I recall driving through endless highways, my mind lost in the swirl of every event that led me there. Sometimes I'd think about Tom's face, twisted with fury. Other times about Jen, her whisper of apologies in that voicemail. And occasionally, I'd be overtaken by a wave of sorrow, so strong I'd have to pull over and gasp for air. Oddly enough, it was on one of those highways, a desert stretch under a blazing sun, that I felt something shift inside me. I'd parked the car, stepped out onto the cracked asphalt, letting the heat wash over me until sweat trickled down my brow. And in that blistering emptiness, something let go. Maybe it was the last vestige of longing or the final shred of vengeance. I stood there for a long time, stared at the cloudless sky, and realized that even though the pain had hollowed me out, I was still alive. That small fact felt like an epiphany. Asterisk, I'm alive. I can keep living. I don't have to die in this heartbreak. Asterisk, it might sound too simple, but that was the moment. It didn't make everything better or erase the betrayal. But it reminded me that I could choose to move forward, even if the path ahead was uncertain. Eventually, I got back in the car and kept driving. Weeks later, I ended up in a small coastal town, far from any major city. I found a modest motel near the shore, run by a gray-haired couple who greeted me with genuine warmth. The man, around his mid-50s, wore a worn baseball cap, reminded me a little of my father. When he handed me the room key, he asked with a friendly grin what brought me there. I shrugged and said something about needing a change of scenery. He nodded in understanding, as though he recognized the weight behind my words. I spent my days walking that beach, letting the rhythmic crash of waves lull me into a calmer state of mind. I'd watch seagulls dive for fish, watch families with children laughing as they built sandcastles. Some days, I'd think about Jen. I wouldn't lie. I still felt an ache, a sense of loss. But it was tempered now, filtered through the understanding that the life I had was gone, and I had to figure out who I was without it. Other times, I'd remember how I'd systematically brought Tom's empire to its knees. A part of me still wrestled with guilt about going that far, though another part insisted he deserved it. At night, lying on the stiff motel mattress, I'd stare at the ceiling and feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. The faint stirrings of hope. I wasn't sure what it was hope for exactly. Forgiveness, peace, a chance to love again. I had no answers, but the mere presence of that feeling told me I was still human beneath the layers of bitterness. Sometimes I'd hear the echo of Jen's words in my head. Asterisk, I love you, James. I'm so sorry. Asterisk, I never responded to her messages, never reached out again. But in that quiet darkness, I'd whisper to the walls, I'm sorry too, though I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to, her, or myself, or maybe the memory of who we used to be. Over time, I realized that wanting to die had receded. The cold floor of my living room, the paralyzing heartbreak, the unstoppable rage, those had given way to a dull acceptance that life goes on. If I had to sum it up, I'd say not every scar is visible, but each one eventually teaches you something about your own resilience. Months passed. One day, an envelope arrived at the motel. It contained legal documents confirming my final ownership of certain holdings from Tom's fund. He'd relinquished any further claims. There was also a personal note, typed but with a scrawled signature. Asterisk, take it. I'm done fighting you. Enjoy the spoils. Asterisk, no apology, just resignation. I skimmed it, then folded it up and tossed it in the trash. That part of my life was over. Another envelope arrived days later. My final divorce papers. Jen had signed. No contest. Just like that, we were officially strangers. The motel owner handed me the envelope with a curious glance, but I just thanked him quietly and headed to my room. When I opened it, a wave of finality settled in my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed, running my hand over the lines of text. No tears came. I felt a small pang of sorrow, but also relief. Asterisk, we were done. Asterisk, I stepped outside, breathing in the sea air. The gulls screeched overhead. A breeze ruffled my hair, and I closed my eyes, letting the moment wash over me. For so long, I'd harbored that intense mixture of pain and vengeance. Now it felt like I was standing on the edge of something new. Uncertain, but free of the old weight. The emptiness was still there, but it wasn't as suffocating. Maybe that's all we can ask for after betrayal. The chance to rebuild from the ashes. I don't know how my story ends, not really. I'm just a man who was broken, who broke others in return, and who finally realized that staying broken was a choice I didn't have to make. Some nights, I still lie awake, remembering the scene of that couch or the hush in our bedroom afterward. But other nights, I drift to sleep with the gentle roar of the ocean, thinking about tomorrow and the day after that, and the fact that I even consider tomorrow might be the biggest step of all. In the end, I learned something I wish I never had to learn. Not all pain is visible, but it will consume you if you let it. I can't say I'm whole again, but at least I'm here, breathing, walking along an empty beach at dawn. The nightmares visit less often. The anger recedes, and somewhere, maybe there's a part of me that can still open up to life again. That's how I've come to measure my days now, not in what I've lost, but in the quiet steps I managed to take away from the wreckage. Sometimes, the memory of her laugh still finds me in the lonely hours, and sometimes I think of Tom's smug grin. But I let those memories float through me, like waves that rise and fall. I don't cling to them anymore. It's not absolution. I don't believe in clean slates. It's just the smallest taste of freedom. The realization that I might still have a life worth living, even after everything. And perhaps for a man who once wanted to die on his living room floor, that's enough of a victory.